Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel. I'm so delighted you've joined me wherever you are in the world. And if you love a really good story, there's nothing that beats a good story, then you're tuning into the right channel. And if you have a fascination for Bigfoot and the hairy man, then this definitely is the channel for you. And if you haven't subscribed, I strongly recommend that you do. Let's get started with our story tonight. Dear Sarah and all your listeners, it was in 1957 and I was 25 years old at the time, and I was not married, unlike all my fortunate friends who not only had wonderful husbands but babies on the way too. In those days, being 25 and not married was like being an old maid or left on the shelf, so to speak. Thankfully, it's not like that today, but that was how it was then. I was living with my parents at the time in a very large bungalow, and even they were piling on the pressure for me to get married. When is Roland going to do the decent thing and pop the question, my mother would ask. You're not getting any younger, my dear, and I'm longing for some grandbabies. At this rate, I'll be deceased before you have any. I had been dating Roland for 8 long years, and he still had not asked me to marry him. I couldn't understand what was keeping him from asking me the question, because we'd been together for so long and we were incredibly close. It seemed like the natural next step. One day when I was sitting on my friend's lawn having drinks with some of my girlfriends, they all quizzed me about Roland. You need to give him an ultimatum, said one of my friends. Otherwise that dude is never going to pop the question. You can be sure of that. Everyone wholeheartedly agreed. If he doesn't want to marry you, all well and good, said another. At least you know where you stand. You don't want to be 30 and still unmarried. What they were saying made perfect sense to me, even though it was not the done thing in those days for a woman to take the initiative in marriage proposals. However, if I didn't give Roland a push, we might never get married, and that thought was inconceivable. It was on a Sunday afternoon, when Roland and I were taking a drive in his car around the countryside, when I broached the subject. Roland, I said, I'm 25, and I'm not getting any younger. Yeah, he said, so? With a dopey expression on his face. Well, I want to get married and have kids. Roland's mouth did a nosedive, and he looked at me with a horrified expression on his face, almost as if I had just told him that he was sentenced to life imprisonment. He looked utterly mortified. You want to get married, he said. I nodded. We've been dating for over 8 years, I said. Isn't marriage the next logical step? Where do we go to from there? Roland's mouth was so wide, it looked like he could swallow an entire goldfish. That's how shocked he was. For a long while, the car was very, very silent. You could have heard a pin drop. Then he said nothing. He pressed down the accelerator really hard and took me home as quickly as he could, without even saying a word. When I got out of the car, he still hadn't said anything. I slammed the door behind me, and he never even said goodbye. Tears rolled down my cheeks as I realized that our relationship was well and truly finished, and I was never ever going to hear from Roland again. The idea of marriage had completely freaked him out. Well, at least I knew where I stood, I thought regretfully, but I was devastated. Imagine my surprise when about 3 or 4 days later, Roland called me and asked me out on a date. I could hardly believe it, because I'd resigned myself to the fact that we were well and truly finished. Roland told me to close my eyes, and he led me into a beautiful clearing in the woods, where he had prepared a beautiful, spectacular picnic. There was champagne on ice, strawberries dipped in chocolate, salmon sandwiches, and turkey and cheese rolls, as well as sumptuous chocolate cake. It was a delicious spread, and I could not believe he had gone to so much trouble on my account. I was amazed and really, really touched. Suddenly Roland got on his knees and presented me with a fine velvet-looking box. Was he doing what I thought he was doing? I could hardly believe it. He opened it up slowly, and there, staring at me, was the most enormous, glistening, bright yellow diamond engagement ring, surrounded with clusters of perfectly beautiful white diamonds. I'd never seen anything so beautiful in my entire life, and he slipped it on my finger and popped the question. "Will you marry me, Sue?" he said. "Oh, yes, yes, yes!" I cried, jumping up and down like an excited puppy. The ring was very loose on my finger, and I knew it would need to be adjusted. But you know what? I didn't want to spoil the moment by saying anything to Roland, because I was just too delighted. "How could you afford this ring?" I asked. "It must have cost you an absolute fortune." "Never you mind about that," said Roland. "Only the best is good for you." I could not wipe the smile off my face, and I raced to my best friend's house to tell her the good news. "Oh, I'm so happy for you," she cried out in delight. "Oh, my word! Let's see the ring." Beth let out the most enormous gasp as she studied the ring on my finger. "Oh, my goodness! But it's beautiful! Did Roland rob the bank?" Beth called her mother over to view the ring. "Mum, you've got to see Sue's ring. It's utterly gorgeous. It's the most beautiful ring I've ever seen." Beth's mother had a background in jewellery, so she knew a lot about diamonds and about precious stones. I watched her mother's face study my ring with a look of shocked intrigue on her face. "Where did you say Roland got this ring from?" she asked curiously. "I've no idea," I said. "Oh, I'm so thrilled. I love the huge yellow centre and the diamonds around the edge. It's so unusual." "Well, it is a yellow diamond," said my friend's mother, "and it's worth a great deal of money. You are a very, very lucky girl." I looked at Beth and her mother in shocked disbelief, and without knowing what to say, I suddenly excused myself and hurried back home. Roland lived in a very basic cabin, and you couldn't get more basic than what he lived in, on his parents' land, and all his life he had struggled financially to make ends meet. How on earth had he managed to present me with such an expensive stone? Feeling both frustrated and bewildered and shocked all at the same time, especially after having realised how valuable the ring was, I now had so many questions in my mind, and my gut was not feeling good about my engagement ring. Something was distinctly off. I decided to go for a run in the woods. This was something I always did when I needed to work off a little steam. I put on my running shoes and proceeded to go for a run, all the while wondering what I was going to ask Roland about my ring, without sounding suspicious. I kept reassuring myself that maybe it had belonged to his mother. Yet why would they sit on a ring like this if they couldn't even afford to repair their leaking roof? Nothing made any sense at all. That evening I got a call from Beth. "I think there's something strange about your ring," she said. "Mother said it's worth an absolute fortune. There's no way your Roland has that kind of money, not after he's been through so many financial struggles." "What, are you sure that it's worth that much?" I asked. "Very sure. Also, the stone, well, my mother didn't want to tell you, but it's actually exceedingly rare." I looked down at my finger to examine the stone, and I suddenly realised with horror that the ring was no longer on my finger. "Oh, no, no, no!" I cried. "What's the matter?" asked Beth. "I've lost the ring. It was loose on my finger and it must have fallen off my hand. And I think I dropped it when I was running in the woods. I can't believe I ran with it and it was loose on my fingers. How could I be so stupid?" Beth was horrified. "Are you crazy, Sue? Wearing a valuable ring like that on a run, if it was loose on your finger? You're never going to find it at this rate." I slammed down the phone in a panic. What was I going to do? It was getting dark outside, and my precious ring was lying somewhere in that woods, and I had to retrieve it. The idea of waiting until morning to find it was an inconceivable idea, and besides I would only be lying awake all night worrying about it. I grabbed my father's brand new 1960s metal detector and bounded towards the woods with only one thing on my mind, and that was retrieving that ring. I just had to find it. There wasn't any other option. As I approached the woods, it was eerily quiet, and yet during the day it had been full of beautiful, cheerful birdsong. There was no animal sounds, no owl calls, no crickets, and no calls from coyotes. I heard none of the noises that we would normally hear on a nightly basis. It really gave me an ominous, very disturbing feeling. Needless to say, nothing was going to deter me from my mission. The ring needed to be found, and its questionable value made it that much more significant for me. I started using the detector around the whole area where I usually run, and I was retrieving all kinds of stuff, like old screws and coins. I realised that this was a job that could take all night, because the beeper was buzzing all the time as someone had clumsily sprinkled piles of rusty nails over the entire forest floor, and at this rate I would never find the ring. Suddenly I heard this utterly terrifying noise, and truly it sounded more supernatural than natural, almost like galloping horses' hooves racing through the forest at an enormous speed. But these were heavier than that, and whatever it was, I could tell it was coming in my direction. I quickly got out of the way and hid behind a massive tree that had all this glorious moss growing up its girth. The thundering sound came to a sudden stop, only yards away from where I was hiding, and I could hear a distinct grunting sound that sounded just like an ape. Oh, oh, oh. I was almost too terrified to peek at the creature to see what on earth it was. I could sense that it had a formidable presence, like that of an apex predator. You know, I didn't have to see the creature to know and to feel that powerful presence, because truly, even with my eyes closed, I could sense it. I peered through a hollowed opening in the cavity of the trunk of the tree, and luckily some shafts of moonlight twinkled through the tree and lit up the entire body of this creature. I got a really good side view of the creature, and he was gargantuan. He was bipedal and humanoid in his appearance, although he was definitely not human. He had dark, long hair covering his entire body, and that hair was very human-like. But I detected the side of his long greyish face had no hair at all. He had a very grey skin, a very definite prominent brow ridge, very flat dark skin nose, wide deep-set dark eyes, and very thin lips. I was amazed how much detail I could see under the moonlight, and I realised that it had to be a full moon to get this good a view, and the canopy above my head must have had a large opening to allow this much light to stream into the forest. I was awestruck by this creature and terrified by him at the very same time, if that's possible. If he saw me, I was certain that I would be table scraps for him, because this creature was highly dangerous. He was enormous and had, at a guess, he must have been 7 foot tall and 600 pounds, and possibly even more. I've never been good on measurements, but this humanoid thing was huge. The creature just stood there and sniffed the air, and I realised with horror that he could possibly have detected my human smell. However, the breeze that night was blowing in the opposite direction, so hopefully my scent was too. He continued to sniff, and then his attention was diverted to something that seemed to be wiggling frantically in the bush. It was a deer that had got snagged up in a thorn bush and was frantically trying to escape because it had sensed the impending danger. and it got more and more ensnared, and the more and more tangled up, the more it tried to escape. He started to struggle, and the distress sounds were very haunting, and surely it had just brought attention to itself. This was an easy meal for the predator, and he lunged towards the creature who had absolutely no hope in hell of escaping, and I heard a loud snap that sounded like a limb being disabled, which I imagine was to immobilize the creature. Then I heard a loud rustling sound as the deer was pulled through the brush by the legs, and there came a thunderous thud. I think the hairy humanoid threw the whole deer's body against the tree trunk I was hiding behind with such a brutal force that the deer must have been instantly killed and obliterated. I felt a huge empathy for the poor creature to be killed by such violence. For a moment all was still, and everything seemed very, very silent. And then I heard the creature whistling to himself, just like a human would. It was a pretty sound. Suddenly I could hear slapping sounds around the woods coming from further away. And then I heard the creature responding to those slapping sounds by slapping the tree trunk that I was hiding behind. And he slapped it so hard that the tree trunk virtually vibrated, and I jumped out of my skin, well, almost. Then I heard these strange calls, like whooping sounds, that seemed to be coming from different areas of the woods, left and right and backwards and forwards. The sound was like some kind of interactive communication. It was with horror I realized that there must be others just like him, and the thought of that sent waves of dread flooding through my entire body. By this time I was so terrified and so anxious of being discovered by this creature. I was surprised he hadn't detected me, but maybe it was because the wind was blowing in the opposite direction, because I was certain I had a human odour, because this creature had a pungent smell of its own that reminded me of raw sewage. I do remember that the woods were visited by human hikers on a daily basis, so maybe their human smells were hanging around the place, and maybe that would explain why the creature did not see me, because he may have felt these lingering smells were just smells from previous humans that had been in the forest before me. I peered at the creature and saw him scratching himself with a very long stick that he was rubbing up and down his back, much like a bathroom brush, in the places that he could not reach. And this scratching went on for some time. As he was doing this, I could hear him making low moans of pleasure, as if he had finally satisfied a very, very frustrating itch. I then suddenly heard this thunderous galloping sound coming towards the clearing, and it sounded just like it had the previous time the creature had entered the clearing, so this was clearly another creature. I was freaking out, but whatever creature it was, luckily it didn't come into view, but started to chatter to the creature that was standing near to my tree. And they engaged in a weird form of communication that sounded a lot like gibberish. It was almost like the other creature had come to get him to go back to where they were nesting. Then the creature threw the deer over his shoulder and trampled through the dense thorny thicket and thundered away. I couldn't believe that he just ran through a bush of thorns just like that, as if it was nothing. I could hear two of these creatures now tearing through the forest like a couple of massive bulldozers, and when they moved, the trees swayed under their great girths, and these are big trees that we're talking about. After they had gone, all was silent, and then suddenly the chorus of crickets started all up all over again, and I could hear the sounds of owls and coyotes. In my terror, I just fled from that forest as fast as I possibly could, leaving my dad's metal detector behind, and even the precious diamond ring was lying there somewhere on the forest floor, and by now I really did not care. I needed to get away from this forest as fast as I possibly could. It was weird because I seemed to have a delayed panic response after having seen that weird creature. When I got home, I broke out into a terrible anxious sweat with hives all over my body, and I started to hyperventilate. My mother panicked when she saw me in such a dreadful state, so she called the emergency services, and I was rushed to hospital immediately. Everyone thought I was having a cardiac arrest, and so did I. I even remember thinking that the creature may not have killed me in the forest, but he was killing me now due to my post-traumatic shock. I was later to discover that I had just suffered from a panic attack. But boy, did it feel like the real deal. It took me a long while to calm down, but I returned home later that evening with a clean bill of health, only to become even more anxious when Beth phoned me the following morning. "I don't know how to say this to you," she said, "but the ring Roland gave you is definitely stolen." "What makes you say that?" I asked. "Well, there was an armed robbery at the jeweller's and a whole lot of precious jewellery was stolen, and some of it was incredibly valuable, especially, and listen to this, a yellow diamond engagement ring that was worth a fortune. The ring was described as being a round yellow diamond surrounded with a cluster of white diamonds." I knew in my gut then that Roland had stolen that ring, but to hear my friend confirm my worst fears was utterly terrifying. If this got out, Roland could be looking at a long-term prison sentence. Why had he done something as reckless and as stupid as this to jeopardize our whole future together? Was he completely insane, I wondered? And at the very least, he'd have a criminal record, which was hardly a good start. I thanked Beth for the information, and then I raced to Roland's parents' house as fast as I could, in my little car. I whizzed down the bumpy dirt track, parking my car outside Roland's cabin. I knew without a shadow of a doubt that Roland had definitely robbed the jewellers, and I had to make it right and fix this problem before things got seriously out of hand. The cabin door was wide open, and there was no one around, but the place was a total pigsty, with clothes haphazardly gracing every available surface area of the cabin. There were empty Chinese takeaway cartons, finished pizza boxes, as well as crushed beer cans scattered everywhere. I started searching every area of his cabin, trying to find the rest of the missing jewellery he had stolen. I was shocked to find that all the jewellery had been placed in a large coffee tin and was sitting close to the bright red kettle on the sideboard. Roland's toy gun was lying across the sofa, but it was such a good imitation of the real thing, I imagined he had used it in the robbery, and the jeweller had clearly believed it was a deadly weapon, and I could understand why, because it was so realistic. I also discovered the remnants of the most ghastly facial hair accessories I have ever seen in my entire life. They were excessively thick. There was a fake beard, bushy eyebrows, and a moustache lying across the bathroom sink, and I realised that this was the disguise Roland had used to change his appearance, and he must have looked horrendously hairy in his disguise. I flung all the jewellery into my handbag and raced home, and then I proceeded to pile on loads and lashings of red lipstick and eyeliner, and I put on an auburn wig as well as a dress of my mother's so as to appear older than my natural age. I then placed all the jewellery in a box and wrapped it up in a brown paper box with a red ribbon tied around the middle. A little bell jingled as I entered the jeweller's store. "Hello, ma'am. Can I help you?" said a jovial man wearing round glasses and a very big smile. "Are you looking for anything in particular?" "I'm looking for the manager," I said. "I am he," said the man. "How can I be of service, madame?" "This is for you," I said. The man opened the box and pulled out the jewellery in his long, pale hands, and then his eyes grew as wide as saucers, and his skin became pale and white. He looked very surprised. "This is the jewellery that was stolen from my store 3 days ago during an armed robbery." Everything is here, minus a very precious yellow diamond ring. Where on earth did you find this? Let's just say it came into my possession, I said. And with that, I boldly walked out of the store with the jeweller asking me, "Hold on, madam. I have more questions I need to ask you." I ran to the car as fast as I could. I dived into the seat, turned on the engine, and pressed down the accelerator as fast as I could, and I raced home at an unspeakable speed. The following day I heard my mother and father talking together. They were discussing the papers, and my father always read the articles out for us to listen to, while my mother cooked breakfast. She was making fried eggs and bacon on the gas hob. This was something he always did, so that we knew what was going on in the world, without having to tune in to the radio. And besides, my father enjoyed listening to his own voice. My father read, "Jewellery theft mystery. A mystery woman with auburn hair ventured into the jeweller's yesterday, presenting the store manager with all the missing jewellery that was stolen on Tuesday, with the exception of a yellow diamond engagement ring, which is said to be of extreme value and very rare, that is still missing. The manager described the mystery woman as young and glamorous and attractive. She was very well spoken and polite, but I sensed she knew more about the robbery than she was letting on. When I tried to question her, she ran away. She did not want to talk. The jewellery store in question suffered a dangerous armed robbery at about 10:33 on Tuesday morning. The armed bandit was described as a particularly hairy man with very bushy eyebrows, moustache and long unkempt beard. It was difficult to see his face because of his excessive facial hair, but he did have a slender body shape and was about 6 foot tall. If anyone knows who the mystery auburn-haired woman is, or the armed hairy bandit, or who has seen the yellow diamond ring, call us on 5565567. "Fancy that," said my mother in surprise. "Who commits a robbery and then returns all the loot? I've never heard anything so crazy in all my life. What is this world coming to?" The next day, there was another newspaper report that read, "Mrs. Rebecca Greenwood was walking her dog in the woods yesterday when she distinctly heard a loud whistle and sensed that someone very hostile was looking at her. It was a horrible feeling," she said. "I knew there was a man staring at me because I could feel his eyes on me, and they were menacing and very creepy. Suddenly I saw this yellow diamond shining brilliantly and brightly on the forest floor, and I knew at once it was the stolen yellow diamond ring from the jewellery robbery. I picked it up off the ground and I heard the man rustling behind the tree, and he was trying to scare me and intimidate me with his heavy movements, almost like he was pretending to be a bear or something very big. I was not going to fall for his act. I think he was angry that I'd found the ring, because he thrashed the tree very hard and growled at me like a lion, and his imitation of the creature was alarmingly good. But I refused to be terrorized by such a bully. He was probably thinking I would drop the ring and run away in terror, but I am not easily fooled. I believe this armed, unshaved, hairy bandit is living in the woods, and he is possibly looking for the lost diamond that he dropped, because the metal detector he was using was on the ground close to the ring. I surmised he was probably searching for the thing before I showed up with my dog and hid from me, in case I identified him. I will not be going to the woods any time soon, because the armed bandit is there. He even upset my dog, who usually conducts herself very well, but since she has returned home, her lavatory habits have changed dramatically, and she is wetting herself regularly. I have had to use nappies on her to prevent further accidents. I do believe this horrible man is to blame for poor little Nettle's anxiety." As you can imagine, I hooted with laughter when I read the article, because I think Mrs. Greenwood possibly encountered the creature I had seen the night before. I'm glad to tell you that things settled down in the town, and the robbery was soon forgotten, as other scandals invariably surfaced in their place, as they invariably do in small towns like us. I did confront Roland about the jewellery theft, because it was so out of character for him to have done something as dreadful as this. I'm glad to say that the deadly weapon was, in fact, only a toy gun, so no one would have even been hurt, but even so it does not excuse what he did. And the reason he didn't ask me to marry him for 8 long years was because he wanted to buy me a fancy posh ring, and he couldn't afford it. So instead he chose to steal the most expensive rare diamond from the jewellers. I still cannot believe what he did, but I know his motive was born out of love and giving me the perfect ring, and so for that I do forgive him. Roland and I have now been married forever, and I love him so much, but he could have been locked away, or at least reprimanded very severely, if he had been caught, or because of a yellow diamond engagement ring. The thought of him being locked away for this does not bear thinking about, but people do the craziest things for love. As for the creature in the forest, I was to find out years later he was a Bigfoot or a Sasquatch or hairy man. You choose what you want to call him. One thing I know is that he is real, because I saw him myself when I went hunting for the yellow diamond. Oh, that was a wonderful, wonderful story. Well, I just want to say thank you so much for that amazing story. Until next time, goodbye and good night.